Tensions are on the rise in Lebanon and have been since word came out regarding the special tribunal for Lebanon, which is looking into the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri. And the leaks have been that the tribunal will issue its indictments before the end of this year, and that the finger will be pointed at members of Hizbollah. Since July, this has raised tensions tremendously in Lebanon. Hizbullah's leader, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, came out early and forcefully saying that the tribunal has been politicized and that its evidence is tampered with, and that any indictments against Hezbollah are politically motivated. And he has said that anybody who collaborates with the tribunal is effectively collaborating politically with Israel, the US, and others to undermine the resistance. So he raised tensions very high. The tensions remain high over this issue, although there are intensive negotiations among Lebanese politicians and involving leaders of other countries from the region to try to find a compromise on this very tense crisis. Well, the scenarios that seem to be facing Lebanon are several, many of which will play out before the indictments come out. Hezbollah, backed by Syria and Iran, has been expecting the indictments to come out, probably before the end of the year, and they are pressuring Saad al-Hariri, the Prime Minister, and his government to take a position regarding the tribunal before the indictments come out. And they want that position to include a kind of a denunciation of what the investigation and tribunal has done so far, or at least cast a lot of doubt on that. And they wanted to include a freezing of Lebanon's financing and actual judicial cooperation with the tribunal. They want that to happen before the indictments come out. And they will probably move to try to make that the case. The various options they can use are the following. Currently, there's a lot of political rhetoric, a lot of political pressure. They could raise that pressure politically by boycotting or freezing government decision-making and freezing parliamentary decision-making, in other words, paralyzing the state fully. They could also encourage civil disobedience, which would include closure of roads, maybe closure of the airport, to add pressure. The other option they have, if they wanted to raise pressure further, would be to use armed action, arresting people, taking over parts of the city or all of the city, the capital, which they did in May of 2008. So they have a number of options, but they are reluctant to use them because they don't want a sectarian clash between Shias and Sunnis in Lebanon. They also don't want the current Prime Minister to resign because they want him to give them the concession, not another Prime Minister. So it's a delicate game. If the indictments come out after the Lebanese government has been forced to make these concessions, maybe the indictments will come out and will not have a massive set of repercussions. It is probably already the case that given Hezbollah's influence in the government will not be able to proceed with arrests or judicial, actual operations in Lebanon in support of the tribunal, because the opposition, which has a controlling, blocking vote in government, will block that. If the indictments come out soon, when the climate is still tense as it is today, without any concessions or compromise, the indictments might inflame passions in the country among Shia and Sunni communities and could lead to uncontrolled violence, which is very unpredictable, although both parties are trying to avoid that. The regional players are playing a very significant role in Lebanon and in this crisis. Syria has repaired its relations with the current Prime Minister, Saad al-Hariri, who is the son of the assassinated former Prime Minister. However, Syria is backing Hezbollah in its opposition to Lebanon's links with the special tribunal. So it's sort of playing both sides of the fence with the Prime Minister. Syria would probably like the Prime Minister to stay as Prime Minister, but to concede on the issue of the tribunal. The Prime Minister is holding firm so far on the issue. Saudi Arabia, which is the patron and the main backer of the Prime Minister, has had much improved relations with Syria over the past many months. They worked together during the Iraqi elections and the government formation process, and they've been trying to work together in Lebanon as well. Saudi Arabia figures that by working with Syria, it can help protect and promote the interests of its Sunni communities in Iraq and in Lebanon. There was a falling out in Iraq after Syria fell in line with the Iranian sort of choice for Prime Minister in Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki. Relations deteriorated, and that might have caused a deterioration of relations over Lebanon as well. Saudi Arabia does not want the situation in Lebanon to explode into sectarian warfare, but they are not also wanting to concede on this very major issue of the Special Tribunal of Lebanon, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, because the Special Tribunal, of course, is part of international legality. It's linked to the Security Council of the UN, and it would be very problematic for Lebanon and for Saudi Arabia for Lebanon to break its ties with the tribunal. So a lot of negotiation going on there between the Saudis and the Syrians. The Iranians, of course, are also very involved. Of course, they're the main backers of Hezbollah. They have been, of course, very critical of the Special Tribunal. President Ahmadinejad of Iran visited Lebanon a week ago, and aside from his visit to the south, which was very much focused against Israel, his visit to Beirut and to the president and other officials very much emphasized conciliation and the need to find a negotiated solution to Lebanese crises. So he sort of lent his voice to a negotiated outcome to this tribunal issue. But tensions remain high despite the regional attempts, both contentious and negotiated. Syria has certainly regained a lot of influence in Lebanon. And this is partly because Syria had maintained strong allies in Lebanon, which of course were led by Hezbollah and the rearming of Hezbollah that took place after 2006, and a number of other allies in Lebanon which allied with Hezbollah and were allied with Syria. What added to Syria's influence was the shift in policy mainly from Saudi Arabia. That in previous years, Saudi Arabia had backed the March 14 movement in a way, and that was antagonistic to Syria. They backed it to weaken Syria and to oppose Syria. But in 2008, they realized that Hezbollah and its allies was more powerful than the March 14 groups and actually overpowered them in Beirut in May. And the threat from Hezbollah was very real and very overwhelming. The same was true of their conclusions in Iraq, that whereas early on they were supporting Sunni groups in Iraq to counter Syrian influence and Iranian influence, that backfired there as well. Also, after the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005, rather than Saudi Arabia and the US gaining influence in Lebanon in the medium term, they found that Iran was gaining influence in the vacuum. So I think they figured that to protect their Sunni sort of allies and to moderate or manage or reduce direct Iranian influence and Hezbollah influence, they found that it was preferable for them to deal with Syria and to try to coax Syria closer to their position, not necessarily to break with Iran, but to sort of game that relationship. And hence they're working with Syria and Iraq, and they're working with Syria and Lebanon. And that has led initially to Walid Jumblat, the leader of the Jewish community, fully reorienting, in a sense, to rebuilding relations with Syria, and the Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri also reorienting, rebuilding his relations with Syria. Syria, however, is demanding more of Saad al-Hariri. Syria is demanding that he get rid of most of the advisors that were surrounding him at the time when he was pursuing a very anti-Syrian policy, and they're pressuring him to de-link from the tribunal. So in a way they've accepted to rebuild relations with him, but they're really in a way denuding him of what he stood for a long time. And he's so far holding firm, but he's in a very difficult position. Iran certainly has a lot of influence through Hezbollah itself, which is the strongest military force and a very wealthy group, and through Hezbollah's allies in Lebanon as well. And as an emerging regional power, a lot of players in Lebanon, as they look to build alliances and so on, are recognizing that Iran is going to be a big player for years to come in the region, and that it makes sense to build some kind of relations with it. In a sense, there is a bit of competition between Iran and Syria over who really calls the shots in Lebanon. It's not a hostile competition. They are strategic allies. They generally cooperate on most issues. But Syria has always wanted to say that Lebanon is Syria's sphere of influence, and Iran is playing in this sphere by Syrian, say-so. Whereas Iran, especially with President Ahmadinejad's visit, trying to show that this is sort of a direct part of the Iranian sphere of influence. Saudi Arabia is trying to play on that sort of competition. I don't think it's terribly significant, but it does exist. Iran also generally respects Syria's role in its immediate neighborhood and consults closely with it and would not want to antagonize it. So I would say Iran certainly has a lot of influence, but Syria, by agreement, is playing the more hands-on role and the more detailed role. Also, as an Arab country, Lebanon being an Arab country, the relations and the language barriers are quite different. The links between Iran and Hezbollah are essential, fundamental, and far-reaching. Most of the financing, the arming, the training, and much of the leadership liaison comes from Iran. Hezbollah, at the same time, is a Lebanese political party. It participates in the Lebanese parliament and government. It has a large sphere of independence from Iran on many issues, and autonomy and coordination on other security and strategic issues. Hezbollah plays more than one role. In the bigger strategic role, in playing the role of a proxy deterrent force for Iran, facing Israel and behind Israel, the United States as a deterrent, Hezbollah certainly coordinates very closely with Iran. It's my reading that if Iran were attacked, Iran would have enough influence on Hezbollah and enough pull to make sure that Hezbollah engages if Iran wants it to. That deterrent is there to be used if Iran chooses to use it, although that would be a very devastating war if it occurred between Hezbollah and Israel. The U.S., through, of course, its official, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, who visited Lebanon and has been visiting other capitals in the region, as well as statements from the U.S. administration emphasizing the need to fully support the tribunal and to continue that very strong relationship between Lebanon and the tribunal, while at the same time emphasizing the need to avoid escalation or instability in Lebanon. The U.S. is not apparently deeply involved currently in these sort of closed-door negotiations between Lebanese politicians, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and maybe Iran. But it plays a very important role in a number of ways. Firstly, continuing to lead the international community in its support for the tribunal. Regardless of what happens in Lebanon, the tribunal will and must move forward quickly and issue its indictments and move forward as an international court for truth to be out finally after 5 years of investigation. The U.S. also remains very supportive of the Lebanese government and the Lebanese state, something that is necessary and needs to continue. And the administration is trying to maintain its level of support for the Lebanese armed forces, which is about $100 million a year of military support, most of it non-lethal, but very essential for the operations of the Lebanese armed forces. The border between Lebanon and Israel is generally quite stable. There was the incident in early August between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Lebanese armed forces, which threatened to get out of hand. I think all parties, though, learned a lot from that incident. They all want to avoid it and avoid any repetition of that. The UNIFIL forces, which mediate between the Israeli army and the Lebanese army, also learned a lot of procedural lessons and are much more attentive. So I think that incident was kind of an inoculation against further incidents in general. The border, therefore, I expect will remain quite stable in the immediate period. Neither the Israelis nor the Lebanese nor Hezbollah has an interest in escalating now. But there are fears that next year, if the Iranian nuclear issue is not resolved, sometime next year Israel might begin raising serious concerns about that program and might begin considering more seriously military options or attacks on Iran, which would necessarily affect Hezbollah or might include attacks on Hezbollah, or Hezbollah might retaliate. So the concerns are high, but for the future, not for the present.